There's one thing about all that it would be well to define. What do the majority of people call aesthetic pleasure? What goes on in their mind when a work of art pleases them? There is no doubt about the answer. People like a work of art that succeeds in involving them in the human destinies it propounds. The loves, hates, griefs and joys of the characters touch their heart. They participate in them as if they were occurring in real life. And they say a work is good when it manages to produce the quantity of illusion necessary for the imaginary characters to rate as living persons.
Yeah, that's very good. That's great.
The dehumanization of art.
That's too human.
Yeah.
It's too human. Yeah.
That's what he's criticizing. Or he, that's the funny thing about it, that he explains it so well what people generally want out of a painting or you know, a literature or whatever.
Yeah.
But he's saying that that's the wrong attitude to it.
It's kind of the vulgar,
yeah,
the normal, common people and the fine bourgeois people to take pleasure on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of not good enough.
I think he likens it to a sort of narcotic kind of experience. That is,
He is very, I mean, he's this close to using the concept kitsch for what people really want.
Yeah.
And how it's immoral to want it, or it's immoral to try to trick the audience into liking it because it involves you, you know, viewing it as a real life situation.
Yeah.
But he goes on here. I just wanted to finish that because I think it's a beautiful description.
Mm.
In essence, the object which concerns them in art, which serves as the focus of their attention and the rest of their faculties, is the same as in everyday life. Human beings and their passions. And they will call art that which provides them with the means of making contact with human things. Thus, they will tolerate certain forms of Thus they will tolerate certain forms of unreality and fantasy only to the extent that they do not interfere with their perception of human forms and situations. As soon as the purely aesthetic elements become dominant and detached from the human story, the public loses its way and does not know what to do before the stage, the book, or the picture. Understandably, people know of no other attitude when faced with such objects than that of habit. The habit of always becoming sentimentally involved.
Yeah.
And the funny thing, you know, I thought about this when I suggested this as a topic, and then afterwards I thought, well, what does he actually write about? Like, do I remember it as what I would like to remember it, or is it really something there? And the great thing about him is that he describes modern art, the whole foundational principles of art, in the same way as I would describe them, or you would describe them, right? And we can sit here and agree with him. I mean, of course, this is still at the point where he's describing what people want, and that it's not good enough, as you mentioned. But I mean, it's like he describes it very clearly. Yeah.
He goes all the way, and at the end, the book he ends up a bit with, but this is just kind of a vague ideas of what art is. So don't take it seriously.
Yeah, and that is more possible that everything he says is wrong. In fact, like in the myriad of possibilities in the world, because I think he subscribed to this kind of worldview that he labeled Perspectivism. Which I think he had some sort of background in both phenomenology and also in the Kantian doctrine. And I think basically it echoes a bit of the Kantian philosophy here. Very,
smells Kant and Hegel all over. It stinks. Kant and Hegel all the way. It's not just smells. You go into and it's...
No, it's and he says, how does he say it, that no one can undertake such a task. I have been moved solely by the pleasure of trying to understand, not by anger or enthusiasm.
Yeah. So he takes a very indifferent kind of approach to it. So I'm not involved into it. It's not that I like it. In fact, the pieces of art that all these young artists are doing are just not really a thing to analyze. But I just approach it as a sort of phenomenon.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he also says that no new good art has been made yet, or
but he praises the sort of the liberation as he describes. I mean, so when he's saying that he's sort of being neutral, that's like a bit optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, he starts also with this kind of separation between two kinds of people, and kind of the sociological aspect of it, which there's you can separate art, the new art or young art, separates people in two groups: the ones who get it and the ones who don't.
Yeah.
And the ones who get it, seems he describes this as they have a kind of a organ of comprehension that the others don't have, and that organ allows them to appreciate this static or pure static experience that he talks about. So then that art will be an art for artists, not for the mass and the people and the crowd, not for the fine good bourgeois, but for a selected group of the best. Then this art will allow them to identify each other in the crowd.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That is very interesting, because that's one of the key aspects that Pierre Bourdieu, the French... Bourdieu, of course.
Yeah.
What he talks about, I think, like 20 years later or something, I think 50s or 55, in his work, The Distinction. This is also the notion of cultural capital, where you basically use the means of distinguishing yourself from something by way of something else, and to then manifest your own status in different layers of society.
Can I interject something? It's so funny because you mentioned Alan Watts, I guess yesterday. And so I sort of picked him up again and listened to something. And he's talking about how those who would like to sort of release themselves, there's something wrong with their lives, that there's all this sort of hassle and rat race. And some of them go to do these ascetic things, to just meditate for 10 hours and not move and these things. And then it's talking about how that becomes sort of this pride that I did it for 10 hours, but he just did it for 5 hours. So you're still in that competition, right? so just speaking of Bourdieu there, it's like you can recognize those chosen people in the crowd. And it's so funny because he's a sociologist, and he's, that's a very strange thing. This sort of hailing of this type of elitism.
Yeah.
And then he describes how the populace, of course, they are generally the ones who want this, what I just quoted, right?
Yeah.
To recognize themselves. They don't have this way of differing between themselves and what they see. They experience it as a real life situation, etc. And he's talking about how they get insulted by this fact. They feel that they're being they've been the heroes now because they're the populace, they're the proletariat, and they are the true heroes. And suddenly comes modern art and just makes fun of them. Yeah. And he's basically saying, screw them. I don't care about those dirty proletariats.
You don't understand it. So. Fuck off.
You're waiting that he would say, that's a real concern. What do we do about this? But he said, no, just fuck off.
And it's quite hard the way that he treats it and puts people there. I mean, he's establishing there kind of another structure of in society, an intellectual, artistic group of elite. That they are just the ones who understand this, and then the rest just can go to hell. It's and
he's that's what you do when you want to. I've never done it myself, but you use metaphors, right? When you want to really push a point, and that's where he uses that metaphor of the window. That's a great metaphor. That people, normal stupid people. They will go to a window and look through the window and look at what is outside.
The beautiful garden on the other side of the window, with all the beautiful flowers and it's so nice.
But those who are sensitive, those who are the elite,
Those who possess this special organ of
will look at the window, so that reality just becomes some kind of abstract pattern behind it.
Yeah.
So they sort of see that thing in itself idea, right? And this is the fantastic thing about this. I mean, this is like 20 pages.
Yeah.
You don't have to do all that work reading Kant and reading Hegel. Oh my God, it's so boring. You get it here.
Yeah. It's concentrated on that metaphor, and he also emphasizes a lot about if the crystal, the window there, the crystal, the glass there, is extremely pure. Then it's much more difficult to concentrate there. So as more pure the work of art is, it's more difficult to get it, to get your focus there. But the one who has this comprehensive organ can stop in the glass, and then the garden on the other side becomes just this flat spots of color distributed on a flat surface, and then you get it. And then it's the kind of approaching to that pure aesthetic experience.
And I think about that conversation I had with Carl on Schweiger, who writes in 1835 and acutely describes the essence of the whole German idealism, or especially Hegel. This thing about how reality just doesn't exist. You can just invent things. You don't have to relate to empirical studies or anything like that. Right? And sorry. Yeah.
Well, when I'm going back a bit with that, that stings Kant and Hegel through his whole essay. But he begins the book saying kind of like, one day it happened to me, I had this sudden idea of writing something about art. Like it came, It doesn't say, okay, no, I'm basing this on Kant or Hegel. No, he suddenly have this idea. Yeah. And then he goes things like that an individual, someone, is no one to define what is to be, what has to be done in terms of moral or art in our time, but it's the imperative of our time who defines that. And the only thing one can do is to bow over that and just follow that direction. Poof. And
he doesn't even question it.
No,
there's no question at all.
No,
that's just amazing. It's I think that's when he. How is it? That's in the very beginning as well. Because his point is that there's a recognizable, not only tendency, but which word does he use, in all the arts. There's one thing that unifies them. Hence the title of the essay, the Dehumanization of Art. And that's and that's why it's also important to sort of open with that description of what people generally want in a painting, whatever, to say that this is what needs to be cleansed out. He's very, very clear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing about purification and a pure aesthetic experience, and then he says that something that the bourgeois and the people, the mass person, blind and deaf to any kind of pure beauty. I mean, he's just saying no one is able to get it, but just the young and modern artist, the one who possesses the quality.
Yeah, basically just getting away from universals. And there was this. Just let me look a little bit here. Because I think about. Could I read one more quote?
And yes, but then we were talking also that this was the first time you got in contact with something written by José Ortega y Gasset, and then you mentioned that there are some Hegel and Kant also that can be found there. Which other things in his essay you could say that it's related to Kant and Hegel?
I think in general this idea of purity, in a sense, that's kind of the most obvious. And And then I don't really know where he lies philosophically, because I think it, in a sense, he talks about kind of the removal of any kind of notion of transcendence and the spiritual purpose, because then you'd relate to something else than the art in itself, which obviously would kind of cross with the whole kitsch philosophy, I guess, which would be like this a strong point of objection, I guess. So I think this is the most kind of that this pure art, I think he refers to, is that it should be high clarity, like the cerebral noon. It should be, in a way, perhaps I'm simplifying it, but it should be more about thought, or just this cognitive, perhaps disinterested pleasure that Kant really talks about, than this emotionally titillating, sentimental or spiritual quality. But I don't know if he's that dogmatic, because he suddenly throws these curveballs where, oh well, maybe I'm wrong about everything and I'm just kind of treading the waters here. So there's it's a bit enigmatic, and again I think it's a bit funny, because he writes in a very titillating way, in a sentimental way. Like his prose his rhetoric is kind of the opposite of what he describes, in a sense, because I guess he could formulate all these points as just purely analytic, philosophical kind of arguments and statements and propositions, and but he chooses to use this heavy prose, and I think in his other works as well are known for being really florid and kind of ornamental. And it's emotional, and so there's a lot of interesting conflicts there that kind of grabbed my attention, and I thought this was a very interesting book. I'd never heard about it, not even from modern artists, which I guess would probably like his writings. So
that's what I wanted to have you, or that we came up with the idea that we should do it together, to hear what, I mean, to what extent a self-declared artist can recognize the things that he's talking about.
Yeah, I can definitely recognize a lot of it. And for me personally, I think I'd not match his criteria, because I'm really concerned with kind of this transcendental or mythological, this kind of universal aspect or domain, albeit in a different way than perhaps a different method, running in a different lane than you. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with his points about this total clarity, this high noon, this completely pure, isolated sort of aesthetic microcosm. But then again, I think he says a lot of interesting things about the tool of the metaphor. I think this is really important for all kind of art, and of course we can kind of disagree about the moral implications or whatever. And then he talks about metaphor, and then irony, which is a common tool in the modernist world. And then he talks about art as being a sort of jest, like this sort of trick, this Ouroboros kind of, the art just started eating itself in a way and reproducing itself, and then kind of it means nothing at all, yet it has this meaning, which also sounds really Kantian in a sense, this purposiveness without purpose. I thought about this whole, when he was talking about the jest, I was immediately thinking about, again, the Jungian trickster type, because his text is really kind of banana peels all over the floor, and there are a lot of like unclarified points. But I personally, I'm kind of dragged to this. I like irony and humor, and I think humor, the inversion of humor, is again this kind of grave seriousness, and from an archetypical point of view. But of course, then by Ortega standards, I would probably be caught in that window kind of metaphor where I just have this goal of a transcendental purpose or a mythological purpose or empathetic purpose, instead of just this meaningless act. But perhaps that's his jest as well, that he wants you to think it's meaningless to, I don't know, manipulate you or kind of Yeah, I'm not sure. It was a bit enigmatic for me to read there.
I think that point really plays into the whole Hegelian strain there about how things have to so-called develop.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that you have to continually eat or attack what was before, and that's where he describes, because that would be development, you know, the cliche of development, and that's why he talks about how what is immediately the immediate predecessor gets much more hate from this new artist, modern artists, than what is, you know, I don't know, it doesn't say 400 years ago, but for example, because that's also a more sort of immediate threat, and something that you really need to say that you're not anymore. And that's interesting, where he talks a lot about Romanticism and naturalism, and realism, and how that also was sort of an attempt to just give you scenes directly from life, and that is not sufficient anymore. And that's where it comes into this thing, as you mentioned, the thing about irony and comedy, and
as a fundamental element of the new young art, irony and sort of kind of clownish or joking approach to it.
Trickster.
So that's where you have this thing about that's the Hegelian idea of continual dialectic. You always you never rest at the point you're at. So therefore the irony or the comedy or whatever, which doesn't have to mean that it's like camp or directly funny, but the irony is that you don't mean it literally. And that's the thing that it says that appeals to the modern artist.
Yeah, and the more unreal it is.
And that's a funny thing.
It becomes more real somehow, and then you have this dialectical procedure. But I was thinking about his whole gripe with Romanticism, because he doesn't really talk about, you know, Renaissance art or Caravaggio or anything like that. He specifically targets the romantic attitude and the relation between the people. So I was just thinking about, I don't know if you mentioned it in the conversation or just privately, but you know, this German, I guess it was the kind of Nazi artist sculptor who made these huge sculptures.
Arno Breker?
Yeah, probably. Perhaps his gripes with Romanticism is something similar, when art is subjugated to propaganda in like a political sense. There are obviously some problems there, but perhaps he means kind of that it's the same kind of effect on the people, but in a much more macroscopic lens. That this kind of urge, like he talks about, this narcotic, that it dulls kind of the mind's faculties in a way. It seems like he implies this, and that this is some sort of, in a way, a bit toxic, and that the romantic, you know, the romantic era has been mined dry or empty. Which I guess was an interesting point for
well, it's not that people today don't have talent, but that is dry. It's like an objective historical fact.
It's done.
And that's Hegel again, you know, taking an ideological point and making it sort of into objective science.
And that any kind of aspect of art in time, in history, cannot repeat again. So any kind of repetition in art is impossible. No. But then, of course, he doesn't talk about the Renaissance and what was there, the back of bringing back classical values and reading Aristotle again and so on. So he focuses so much on Romanticism and its quality to appeal to the people.
And I think you have to see this in context with his other work, like Revolt of the Masses, which he digs really into this kind of hierarchical, or like this distinction that we were talking about earlier between kind of the people who strive for excellence in a sense, and then the mass man, or like Søren Kierkegaard would say, Spitsborger, Philistine, I think, Philistine or whatever. This person, regardless of social class and economic status or intellectual stature, that is just so self-righteous, full of himself, that you suddenly, as a public intellectual, for instance, you're suddenly just a political aggregate that's just so happy with your status that you are just one of the crowd, but you are at the same time dictating the values of that crowd without really striving for true scientific or artistic excellence and kind of going beyond.
And that's the irony of criticizing or sort of saying that this is not a political idea, and sort of implying, I guess, as interesting thought, that he's implying that the problem with Romanticism is that it can be used to sway the masses. And then he's building up under the whole basic premise with Kant, where his basic idea, you can read about it in Kant, Art and Art History, is that his political idea is that you have the parliament there, and then on the back row sits the philosophers who have no personal interest. They just view things objectively, and they come in and shall really guide the members of parliament. And then you have the elite. And what is that? That is an outright totalitarian approach.
Yeah, so there are a lot of problems there, but at the same time I find this it's kind of refreshing to read from such a perspective, like this idea about excellence, which I'm sure we all can relate to somehow, even though it kind of perhaps mean different things, or perhaps not the same as Ortega, but this has kind of deep roots really to virtue and the concept of virtue, in a sense that he seems to regard this striving for excellence as a virtue in itself, but then again he says that only a select few have that or manifest that capacity. But that capacity can be manifested by anyone from any creed or age or country or
but it's still an elitist
yeah,
idea.
so
that's the concept of the
some
genius.
sort of democratic elitism.
Elite can come from all kinds of classes.
But it's funny that he points out, and that's a fine organ that you possess, but he doesn't tell you where that organ is located or where's the actual function of it, but says just there's something there. So it's like with Kant also in the Critique of Judgment, that someone that goes into that book suddenly says, I have that organ of comprehension, and I can understand things that the mass doesn't. So it's in a way saying
it is sentimental.
It is because he's cheating you. He's bringing you into an illusion, and he then attacks this kind of play which people find recognize themselves there and feel intoxicated by
and
some
that again
identification.
is exactly the kind of jest that it talks about that art is doing in a way. So,
so the sort of quote-unquote sentimentality here is that the people can recognize themselves as the hero in that play that he's putting up.
Yes, I think so.
He's telling a story there. He's a very good storyteller.
And I think he was, sorry to interrupt you, I think he was also, he was a journalist, or he wrote a lot to the public. And I think that's one of the reasons for his very persuasive and flowy kind of way of writing, and that he doesn't really use, of course, if you read Kant, it's much harder to understand. So he has a much more, again, sentimental and easy to understand language. And it's short, and I think the whole essay collection is like shorter writings. And that's perhaps one of the reasons why he kind of, you can say that he hides a bit about this. Well, I'm just experimenting, I'm just throwing the ideas out there.
I'm just playing.
But,
I'm just playing around. Don't take me seriously.
But this is the smart thing that Kant does, which is a huge basis for Ortega y Gasset, is to say that beauty is created by you. And then like, oh, what, me? Oh. Oh, yes, I can feel that. I can identify with that. And but then he sort of ups the game even more, and let's say that there are some who will understand that. And then you're waiting. Oh, is he going to pick me?
Yes.
And then you can sit there and be really happy if you're chosen, and then it's a question of knowing the game, and then being recognized as performing those rituals that you should perform in this idea. But there's a thing here that I wanted to read, because I think that's also very important. After he describes what people generally want from culture, then he talks about the demonization and really illustrates it. And he says, the art of which we are speaking is not only not human in that it does not comprise human things, but its active constituent is the very operation of humanizing. In his flight from the human, What matters to the artist is not so much reaching the undefined goal as getting away from the human aspect, which it is destroying. It is not a case of painting something totally distinct from man, or a house, or a mountain, but of painting a man with the least possible resemblance to man. Blah, blah, blah. The aesthetic pleasure for today's artist emanates from this triumph over the human. Therefore, it is necessary to make the victory concrete and in each case display the victim that has been overcome.
Yeah, that's very important, to show the victim that's overcome.
Yeah, it's very concerned with that. It's like you could just make completely different forms that people
random
not see
lines on
but that would be beside the point. That's too much work. You want to use something that people know and then really just hammer the destroy
the sculpture there and make a funny thing out from it.
Yeah, and I think that's so the irony or the funny thing all the time is that when he describes that, if you read some conservative critic writing it, he would say, oh, here's this old-fashioned prejudice. But this is a guy who likes it, who thinks that this is a good thing. That's just mind-blowing to me. It's interesting that he doesn't use dehumanizing only in sort of as a adjective in the sense that it's a matter of just not showing what we don't recognize, but it's like a neutral term too. You take. And he describes it, you take a human figure and you paint it in such a way that it just becomes patches of paint. And that is taken literally, something you will not see in the real world.
Yeah.
So therefore it's dehumanizing, not as making fun of it or just a neutral description. It's dehumanizing the human form.
Yeah.
Thank you for checking out this clip from the Cave of Apelles. If you want to watch the entire segment, head over to caveofapelles.com/donate and become a $5 patron. That will allow you to access all our Dark Flame episodes, bonus material with our featured guests, and more.